Hey all, it's David Ducker coming back at you, and today we're going to be talking about monster ecology, deep dwarves, the dvergar, the short, bearded warriors who live beneath the earth, beneath the mountains. So let's start off with the history of the dwarves, because I'll forget that first. So I want to do it before I forget it. So in the age of dragons, when the serpent men ruled over the races of men, which at that time were only one race, the golden race of man. And their empire began to fall and crumble, perhaps through slave uprising, perhaps because of an ice age. No one's quite certain. But some of their slaves escaped into the underground, into the enormous network of tunnels, chasms, and chambers beneath the earth. And these peoples eventually separated into two different lines, with some of them becoming the orcs or uruk, and some becoming the dwarves or dvergar. And these two groups became bitter enemies deep beneath the surface of the earth, with the uruk being more primitive and more violent, more savage, bigger and stronger, and more closely evolved to live in the underground like animals. Whereas the dvergar became more civilized to counter their savage environment. So forging metal, founding religions, building cities, and practicing agriculture, such as it is underground, with vast fields of mushrooms and blind albino cave sheep. You better believe they love some sheep down there. So we have this great contrast, this enmity of old, but eventually at some point the dvergar received a sign from their god to tunnel upward in what was called the quest for sky. As they'd evolved solely underground, the surface world was mythological to them, someplace from the ancient past that they never believed was real. But a great prophet came amongst them, possibly by the name of Moradin, and directed them to tunnel skyward. And they did, and they drove the orcs before them, and this blight of orcs spread out across the world before the dwarves finally broke through. And it is for this reason that the elves, or Eldar or Eladrin, depending on your subspecies, detest dwarves, because dwarves are the bringers of uruks, of orcs. So all the elves hate the dwarves, the dvergar, right from day one. And of course the elvish word for dwarf is gnome, and the dwarven word for Eldar or Eladrin is elf. They don't call themselves elves, and the dvergar do not call themselves dwarves. But other races have corrupted the names and the meanings of them. So this is how the dwarves came to the surface, to the sky. And once they were there, the dwarves, in fact, split into two separate groups. One remained pure to their roots and stayed deep in the earth, only venturing to the surface for some farming activities and religious worship. And these were the pure dvergar, whereas another faction, a sub-race, if you will, started to embrace the surface, trade with them, started to explore the sky in sky ships, and started to learn new technologies, such as firearms from the surface and clockwork. These, of course, are the Khazad, who will be detailed in a separate video. Right now, we're just talking about the deep dwarves, the pure blood dvergar. So appearance-wise, they tend to be a little paler than the Khazad. So they tend towards extreme paleness. In fact, many of them have very dark hair, although it's not uncommon to see some that have blonde or red hair, or even brown as well. They tend to be short and stocky, extremely muscular and thick as well. And other than that, they they retain a remarkable resemblance to humankind, much greater than Uruks, or probably even the elves. Personality-wise, they tend to be very stubborn, very backwards-looking, very lawful, rigid, and unyielding. Even more so than the Khazad. The Khazad are forward-thinking enough to have relations with other races and to develop new technologies, whereas the Dvergar are pure traditionalists, and they would never besmirch their ancestors by moving forward. They must stay close to their ancestors and close to the earth, from whence their culture originates. So for appearance, personality, history. So their fighting style, let's talk about that briefly. So they're used to tunnel fighting. Now they are great smiths, constructing full plate armor, which everyone else just calls dwarf plate. There's no one else has developed that technology yet to have the intricately scalloped and interlocking metal plates covering the whole body. But underneath the ground, in the tunnels under the earth, very often a shield is more of a hindrance than a help. So the dwarves prefer two-handed weapons, which are also required anyway to pierce heavy plate if they were to go to war against each other, which they usually don't, much preferring to attack orcs that remain underground, of course now known as goblins or drow, after interbreeding with those outcasts from the elven communities. But you can check out the video on goblins or the video on elves for more info there. But the Dvergar prefer two-handed weapons, in particular ones that can be used in close quarters. So swinging is usually difficult and dangerous. They especially prefer short spears that they can thrust forward, especially if they do have some versatility in an axe head or a hook or additional spikes or a hammer head on them. But the spike at the top is definitely the most used implement in the cramped quarters they're used to. So definitely the warhammer is their favored weapon, though, as it symbolizes hard work, the hammer of a smith forging steel. And also, it symbolizes on the other end, it usually has a spike, a war pick, and this symbolizes the miner's trade of cutting into the earth and finding that ore and that mineral and questing towards the sky. So the warhammer is easily their most common weapon, always tipped with a spike, though, as that's usually the most important part of any weapon in those close tunnel fights. So their fighting style then is, as I said, two-handed. It's very spiky combat. They don't tend to wear spiked armor, unlike their foes, the goblins, who love to cover their whole bodies in spikes. But the Dvergar prefer smooth surfaces, but tiled in such a way to deflect blows. So now let's go to the cuisine of the Dvergar. So living underground, they cultivate these mushroom fields. Also, they eat a huge amount of mushrooms. And that's probably where the majority of the fiber and minerals, and vitamins in their diet come from. Various preparations of mushrooms. Mushroom soup, in fact, is extremely popular for the dwarves. But now that they've reached the surface, they're so much more enriched than they were with calories, delicious calories, because they can raise rock squab on the ledges in the high mountains. These are essentially large rock pigeons or rock doves that the dwarves have bred to be the size of chickens. So they fly around the dwarven eyries gathering what food they can from the mountainsides, and the dwarfs harvest them and their eggs as need be. So of course the eggs of the rock squab are very important for the dwarfs as well. And then in addition, on those in the mountains, they have the isolated mountain valleys, which often have wild flowers, allowing the dwarfs to become beekeepers and to get honey, which they use for mead and of course for a sweetener. So the bee is incredibly important to the dwarf, and beekeeper is a very important profession. A lot of their meat they preserve by honeying it, and the bee, in addition to being so important for them, for their cuisine, also represents, again, that hard work. So in many ways, the bee is the spirit animal of the dwarf. You know, of the dverga, busy as a bee, loyal to the hive, and marching in lockstep, identical to your neighbors. Now, also in these mountain valleys, the dwarfs, the dverga, raise goats and sometimes sheep. Definitely more so the goats. So goats, of course, are delicious to eat, but they also provide milk, which allows dwarves to create cheese. And in addition, milk, of course, you can cook with milk in a variety of ways. The mushroom soup, cream is delicious in that. So I get some cream mushroom soup going on. But dwarves are renowned as the greatest cheese makers in the world because they rely on it so heavily. They have so many different varieties of cheese, and it's so important to their diet. So there you have just a few staples for them: mushrooms, squab, eggs, mutton or goat meat there, as well as the honey and the goat's milk. So you only have really those 6 really important ingredients, and then as many variations as they can cook out of that. That's what they do. So for shelter, of course, they build underground, and their structures often have enormous weight pressing down on them. And this makes the arch extremely important for dwarven architecture. So all of their rooms and buildings will have arches to them, holding that weight down, often on pillars if it's a large room. And they need multiple arches to support the ceiling, sometimes massive pillars, and all of their doorways are also arched as well. So this creates somewhat of a bottleneck effect. Their doorways are so narrow, and in fact they narrow at the top so that you can't really easily fit 2 people through them, unless it's like an enormous grand door, like going to a throne room or a temple. But they love to create these bottlenecks in their architecture, just in case some goblins should slip through, just in case some mountain orcs should slip through. But in general, their structures, as I said, very defensible, very sturdy, very solid, very thick walls. If they build above the surface, you can expect those arches and those thick walls to continue, and for their structures to be very squat, low to the ground, close to the earth. In our current game, Nuln and Grenstadt were both built by dwarfs. So every time we're describing the architecture, we have to come back to this. And it contrasts great against cities built by humans because they have a very different architectural style. So that's food, shelter. Let's talk about clothing. So of course the skin, the leather, and the fur of those goats is very important for dwarf clothing. To a smaller degree, the feathers of the rock squab, which can be dyed in different colors, and also those that do raise sheep, they can get wool from that. So wool is probably their main textile, with leather probably being very close second. So they do dye this wool very often, although they don't prefer very flashy, bright colors. Very dull earth tones. If it is colored, it's going to be dark. So dark reds, dark greens, nothing bright and flashy. that's all reserved for their jewelry. And Dverga make the greatest jewelers in the world. They have and they wear it constantly and decorate themselves with earrings and nose rings, with finger rings, with elaborate belts and girdles and necklaces. Sometimes ringing their beards, having little rings that they braid their beards through and around. So they definitely are the masters of jewelry. Whenever they show up, everyone knows about it. And indeed, a lot of their currency is in the form of these pieces of jewelry. So if you're carrying your wealth on your person, so it can't be stolen from you very easily. It's not at home. It's always in your sight. And if you need to pay someone or reward someone, you can pop a ring off. You can take one of your chains off and give that to them as a gift. And this is a very personal thing. It's any business transaction is supposed to be personal, so it should be something that could be important to you, a memento or a keepsake like that. Because dwarves are very big on community building. It's communal spirit. So that just reinforces it even more. Even if they're paying with coin, it's also customary to have just that one extra piece that's personal to seal the deal. So it's food, shelter, clothing. Let's talk about, we talked about military to a degree, but I'll also clarify that, in these tunnels, small groups generally work better than large groups. So their army is organized very much commando style, cell-based, fire team-based, if you're using modern terminology. Which again, each is like a family unit heading up to a patriarch, who might head up to an even higher patriarch. So it's very feudal, but it's also very clan-like in structure. As far as their religion, extremely important to the dwarfs. Regardless if you're using Norse mythology and Norse religion, which I usually try to do for dwarves, but you could theoretically plug them in with like a worship of Hephaestus from Greek mythology, or maybe even like a Bast or Bastet from Egyptian mythology, depending on what you're using. But whatever it is, religion will be very important to them. Religion codifies things. To do something religiously is to do something with discipline and dedication, and that's what dwarfs are all about. So they really hold priests and clerics in high esteem, and they're very celebrated and respected members of society. And of course, they would codify their laws to a great degree. If humans have 10 commandments, we can remember. Dwarves might have 10,000 commandments they can remember, because they're so good at memorization, learning by rote. Going into the government of the dwarfs, I was picturing that they would definitely have a hereditary king, as heredity is so important to them. This was what my father did, and I do it, and my son will do it, and I'm part of history. This long line stretching forward into the undiscovered country, which is the future. So I think heredity is so important to them that their king would obviously have this hereditary title as well. And the dwarves would try to turn everything into a science, including rulership. How to rule well. That could be like a dwarven tome. How to rule well. How to be a king. And this is something that other races might take away and force their kings to read, or their princes to read it, because dwarves produce such good leaders, as opposed to like goblins who produce it's the exact opposite. They've been reading Machiavelli. They've been reading The Prince. The Prince of Darkness. So you wanna stay away from any how-to guide from a goblin, because they're probably just trying to sabotage you anyway. So I think that pretty much summarizes the Dvergar, the deep dwarfs. So very insular, closed-minded, closed off, isolationist. They don't trade with people. They don't talk to people. They just keep to themselves, and they do things their own way. And that, it can be a lot of fun given just a little impetus, a little grain of sand for this oyster to turn into a pearl of story. Left to their own with nothing changing, which is how they like it, is very boring, which is how they like it. But if you just throw a little grit in there, you can get a great story out of this as they struggle to deal with a new element to their society. That can be a lot of fun. So I'm also, of course, as I said, going to do a video on Kazab, the sky dwarfs. But this has been Dvergaris, the deep dwarves. I'd love to hear how you do dwarves, isolationist dwarves, deep dwarves, not the steampunk sky gnome, sky dwarf archetype, because, like I said, that is a separate culture for my generic setting, the most generic of settings. But just because it's generic doesn't mean you have to do it poorly. So that I'm going to sign off now. Again, let me know how you do dwarfs. Do a response video. Call me a goof and say that my dwarfs are ridiculous, and you have a more detailed cuisine that's more realistic for dwarfs. I'd love to hear it. So I'm going to sign out now. Everybody have a good day in YouTube land.